Hello, and welcome to my final presentation entitled Inequity and Inequality in Education. So, on here, I'm going to be discussing some of the key findings and major points and factors identified in my annotated bibliography. I'm first going to begin by talking about an overview of the entire presentation, beginning with the original problem of practice and sort of what my thought process was prior to the annotated bibliography, and then how I arrived at my current problem of practice, and sort of how my thinking has transformed and transitioned and sort of organized a little bit more. I think initially, with my problem of practice, I was focusing on a lot on a really broad issue, which was a lot. So really the research process helped me to reflect and really hone in on the big issues, the big ideas, in order to kind of come up with what the actual problem is and then what those underlying factors are that contribute to the problem. So as you can see, my original problem of practice really was unorganized, and you can see my initial thoughts were kind of all over the place. So really I still focused it on the equitable access to education. However, specifically focusing on arts education being a part of a comprehensive education. And I think really diving into and exploring sort of the historical um, impact that inequity on education and inequity in education created for this problem of practice. I wanted to explore how the history really became a contributing factor or underlying factor of my problem of practice. So moving forward to the current problem of practice, I was able to draw some connections to sort of what the actual issues are and what is causing. So moreover, the fact that inequity exists in education, I think that's like common knowledge across the board. But really, how history has impacted education and sort of offerings in urban schools. So even after the Brown versus Board education ruling in 1954, how schools were still inherently unequal. And so it wasn't until sort of that court ordered desegregation came into play in the sort of early 1970s, and a lot of the differences that I was able to identify through the annotated bibliography was that towards the middle to the end of the 1980s, urban schools and schools with low socioeconomic populations were performing at an all-time high since school integration was enforced by the Supreme Court. And so what I noticed was it wasn't just because the schools became integrated, it was because resources were more accessible to integrated schools than they were when schools were separate but equal. And so at the end of court ordered desegregation in the late 1980s, you see this sort of influx of school segregation happening all over again. Families are moving, and you don't have the federal government mandating that in order to receive funding, schools have to be integrated. So schools are presently, in present day, if not more, just as segregated as they were prior to the Brown v. Board of Education ruling. And then another thing that I really found that I thought was interesting in the annotated bibliography process was identifying the fact that depending on the quality of schooling, that students are sort of left in this cycle of low achievement, opportunity gaps, wage gaps, crime, and poverty is at an all-time high for students that attend lower performing schools. And so there's a direct correlation between the school environment and school quality and school offerings and sort of, community needs. Schools are a microcosm of the community, and what is happening in the community is being brought in the school. And when those resources are not made available to students, then students inevitably are failing, are sort of maintaining the cycle of low educational attainment, so forth and so on. And sort of where arts education comes in on this is that the arts have been proven by many of the sources, not only included in my annotated bibliography, but it sources additional sources and outside research, and sort of all the research I looked into during this process, that how the arts can be used as a pragmatic approach to really address inequities in schools, inequalities in schools, and the arts can really be used as a voice for students that are experiencing said inequalities at this point. And so the key theoretical framework that I focused on is that years of unequal treatment and segregation in the United States public schools created a perpetual cycle of inequality in schools between low socioeconomic students as well as minority race groups. And so some of the commonly used analysis methods and measurements that I saw over and over again in the annotated bibliography was the focus group methodology, surveys, interviews, case studies. And so really, not only is inequity and inequality a big issue, sort of that inequality which directly infringes upon students' fundamental rights to learn, really focusing on how the arts are denied to these populations. And that's a big source of inequity. Some of the annotations and some of the articles that I read and research that was conducted focused on how culturally responsive teaching and culturally relevant pedagogy connects to and allows sort of a healthier approach to students. Dr. Gloria Lansden Billings sort of coined this phrase of culturally responsive teaching, and how that culturally responsive teaching can help to produce academic success, as well as critical consciousness. And in school environments and school communities in which crime and poverty is high, really addressing things from a culturally relevant perspective can help students achieve. Arts education is such a big part of a comprehensive education because, as identified in the annotated bibliography, some of those major key findings showed that the school dropout rate was higher for students of color and students with disability. And so a lot of the sort of studies and research and case studies that were conducted focused on project-based arts and how arts education has the ability to limit the dropout rate. In one of the studies, it focused on how a group of incarcerated juveniles, how it changed their perspective on empathy and changed their perspective on how they see the world and how they view themselves. Another one of the articles focused specifically on a mural project in a community that really was, low socioeconomic, as well as a blend of sort of minority race groups that didn't really understand each other's culture. And it was definitely something that impacted how that community functioned. And so they use this mural project as means for social change. And so a lot of the research proved that arts education can be used as an agent for social change. Arts education can be vital as it provides, intervention methods to decrease violent antisocial behaviors in underprivileged youth. And so if this type of pedagogy and this type of programming was put into in an equitable manner inside of schools that are struggling in performing, it really could and has the potential to address some of the challenges that these schools are facing and focusing on. So that leads me to my major plans for future research. And really, it's diving into even more and exploring even more on the historical impact of education. I actually, just between sort of CAE and DAE this semester, I really do believe that arts in school is necessary in order to, really address some of the approaches. So I even entertain the idea for future research as using arts education as sort of an intervention method, and sort of seeing what it may look like as the intervention versus really focusing on the problem. It is a big part of the problem, but I one of the things I will say that came out of this semester that I learned is that it's not just the sort of absence of or the disparities in arts education. Yes, arts education is disproportionately absent all across urban school districts in the United States. And arts education comes with a plethora and a host of benefits that really could sort of change the trajectory of schools and urban students in particular. culturally responsive education, inclusive of the arts, can really help sort of produce that empathy and hone those healthy social outlets. Um, and I think that it is a big, widespread thing. And so, with that being said, I think I definitely want to entertain the idea of conducting some surveys and focus groups and case studies of my own to sort of answer some of the still unanswered questions I have. I think the reason that between the No Child Left Behind Act and other policies, arts education has sort of been lost in translation in terms of importance. And because there's so many other issues that schools are facing, there are healthcare disparities and, of course, proficiency and parent involvement and all these things that the arts can support to do. However, I'm still sort of sitting on the fence to see if arts should be just used as an intervention in further research, or if it is something, because I do believe and I do want to continue to make a case for the arts being in schools. However, I want to see where arts education will come in as most beneficial in order to really address the problem at hand. And so the plans and future research for this topic is really important because the stakeholders are really the most vulnerable beings that there are. It's the students, it's the children, their parents, the school board, school leadership, local education agencies, and the school community. So really, I believe learning um, how to sort of address some of these things, or being able to address some of these things, not only affect these stakeholders but the world at large, because the youth, these students, are our future leaders, our future policymakers, our future school board officials. And in order for them to really begin to make that change and continue on the change, they have to be the first individuals to experience that change.